I want I want to just introduce our two panelists who I am so excited that are here this evening. And one is S. Rasheem, who is a social scientist, who is an independent scholar. And although she doesn't share this in her intro or bio, I'm just taking liberties here, but who incorporates um, um, the the intersectionalities of all of these discussions into the multimedia work that she does, her work in the arts, her work even as an urban gardener, and the way that she talks about issues in all of her work. And it's always so fascinating, Rasheem, to see you on social media. And I hope that you'll put your social media handles in chat so that everyone has an opportunity just to avail themselves of your conversation. You talk about these issues all the time, and you do it in a variety of different ways. So I am just really excited about your sharing with us today, and I thank you so much for coming. And then we have Chris Beegle, who BRJA works closely with his organization, the Center for Restorative Change. And Chris is the director of clinical services. And so excited that you are here, Chris, because we have the opportunity to see how you and the Center for Restorative Change works to disrupt and redirect power, and how you all do that as a matter of course in ways that are institutional and also in ways that challenge the way that individuals in those institutions are serving power. So really glad that you are with us today. And just before we really get into the meat of this, want to give you all an opportunity if you have anything that you want to share about why this discussion was something that inspired you enough to spend your evening with us. Please share.
Okay, I'll go first. I'm Rasheem. I'm really excited to have the conversation about power, to talk about the meaning of power, the types of power, how power operates in our space, in our lived circumstances, and particularly to highlight and bring to the surface some of those ways in which we feel like we may not have power, but we actually do. So excited to get into all of that.
Awesome. And we're going to jump into it. Chris.
Oh, I'm excited to be in this space this evening, and thank you for the welcome. I think for too long, it just not in the past 40 days or 2 months or something, but I'll speak for myself. I've dismissed power. I think we think of it as so grandiose that we often dismiss the power. I've dismissed my own power. And I think that has created huge barriers in how far we've been able to come. And so I'm excited for us to learn together and understand really the nuances of power so that we can take some ownership of it. And especially as a white person, I think I want to speak racially for myself.
Yes, thank you. And that taking ownership piece is so important. So let's get into just some housekeeping issues, and then we'll dive into the discussion. Rebecca, can you pull up some slides, please? Just so that for those who don't know us, we can share a little bit about Baltimore Racial Justice Action. Thank you, Rebecca. So yes, and we welcome you. What other things? So we all know that the session is being recorded. It would be so helpful if your name is visible. And yes, please video on. We've had that discussion. We appreciate that. If your video is off or if you have to go off camera, just put in chat that you'll be right back. Just something that lets us know that your being off camera is temporary. If it is not temporary, we will move you into the waiting room and extend our invitation to you to check out the rest of the session on YouTube. And then just so that we can minimize distracting noise, if you can mute yourself when you are not speaking. BRJA was founded in 2003. It's rooted in our Agents of Change collaborative workshops. Dottie, do you remember those?
Oh,
They began,
yes.
yes, they began in
Right.
1996. And I referenced Dottie because she was a founding member both of Agents of Change workshops and of BRJA. So I'm so glad that you are here today. And Dottie, you are always still learning, and I'm so appreciating the way in which you consistently model that for the rest of us. So BRJA offers either free or low-cost resources. One of our free events is this event, our 13th of the month events, happens every single 13th of the month, and it has for, at least 10 years, even longer than that. This is a way in which we can grow as a community and grow together and develop those connections. We also provide anti-racism, anti-oppression, or ARAO, consultation and organizational development consultation to clients. We work with both local organizations in and outside of the state of Maryland, as well as national organizations. And again, we are so pleased to partner with the Center for Restorative Change, working on a multi-year project of how to disrupt and redirect power in the social services sector. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Stacy. And we have to mention Dr. Wendy Shaya too. Let's move on. And so here's a little bit more information, what Chris and Wendy have shared about themselves. So thank you, Rebecca. I want to start with this. One of the things that we heard at least twice or three times in the introductions is about, the definition of power, the definition of power. And I would prefer that we not start there, because it is so easy to give a definition. But what is probably more interesting and insightful is to talk about those characteristics of power, because it is the characteristics of power and the way that power moves that tends to get lost in conversations about power. So there is some truths about power. And one is that power is neutral. Power isn't good. Power isn't evil. Power just is. And so it is the way in which power is used, which gives it that good, bad, otherwise value judgment. And a lot of times we start out with the reflexive reaction of value judgment of power as being good or power as being evil, which colors everything else that we say or think about power, right? So power is just neutral. It is neither good nor evil. The sources of power are numerous. Usually when we talk about power, we talk about positional power, but there are many other forms of power that we are going to get into. So power is numerous, and oftentimes power isn't even obvious. We, each of us, wield power all the time, but we will use a different terminology to describe it. But all of us wield some form of power every single day. And as we get deeper into conversations about power, we invite you all to look at the ways in which you wield, share, disguise, hoard power in your day-to-day lives, and with whom. Other truisms are that people who have power tend to hang on. They stay way too long at the fair, if you will, because nobody wants to give power up. So people who have power usually hold on to power. They usually tend not to include others in decision-making, even when, and this, Chris, gets into an institutional context, even when institutions say, oh, we're going to have power sharing. That still is based on the whims of the real people who hold power and who are saying, okay, we'll power share, and then who can take that back at any moment. So you always know who holds those levers of power, right? And then people who don't feel that they have power tend to participate in power conversations less, because they just think, well, why should I? Because I don't have power anyway. So there are ways sometimes where we opt ourselves out of the power that we have. right? Are you all with me as I'm trying to set the playing field for these discussions? Okay, this feels real, right? You all see it, right? Okay. And then power can be visible and felt, or it can be invisible and still felt. We may not know where it's coming from, but we definitely know that it is there. Power can be codified and legitimized, like we see in laws and policies, like we see in our households in terms of who makes those decisions and who are bound by those decisions. I will use the easiest example yet, parents and power, right? We don't look at that as power, but it is power. And power can be delegitimized, power can be demonized, power can be criminalized. An example of that, and not to get political, but one person in power made a statement earlier this week that protesting a certain car manufacturer is illegal. So the power of the protest, right, was being criminalized in that moment. And what gave that characteristic of criminalization of protest power is because of the positional power that the person held. So just as is an example. So I want to stop right there before we get into just the common basis of power or the different types of power. Rasheem, Chris, you've heard me say a mouthful. Thoughts?
I got
Was
lots of
it
thoughts.
with
Chris,
which
you
you
want to go
disagree?
first? Or?
Go for it.
Okay. One of the things that you said that stood out to me that I think is also important is the neutrality of power. And I think that that's particularly important when you are in historically minority or historically marginalized populations, because a lot of times our relationship to power is one that is negative. It is one where power and prejudice have combined together to increase oppression, to deny access, right? So the concept of power is something sometimes that we can shy away from or reject or not embrace. And I would, say that that would be a mistake because of the simple neutrality of power, right? If I have my wall socket, whatever I plug into it, it's the power doesn't care what I plug into it. I could plug in a computer that's gonna calculate the cure for cancer, and I could plug in a machine that's connected to a bomb. Power just is. So I feel like that part of starting with the neutrality of it is a really good starting point. And I'm gonna pause here. I got much more to say, but I'm gonna pause here and let Chris chime in on that.
Oh, I appreciate that, Rasheem. I think going off of that, though, along with the neutrality, is the analysis you have with your power, right? So I think like even Adar, when you were talking about, the work of BRJA and anti-racist and anti-oppressive analysis that's being built, and that's the important piece that then comes with power, to me. And then you made me laugh when you said parents in power, as a father of three young ones, right? And just seeing that and what happens in our household with that piece. And yeah, I think in that moment, and then the idea of institutionally and the niceness of power sharing, right? And then how quickly you said that can be removed. And I think we are seeing this in the moment we're in, especially when your back is up against the wall. And when an institution is being threatened because of funding, being threatened because of the work they do, being threatened, how quickly the leaders just wrap everything up as if it never happened. And I think that's the idea then that when you shared that, that's the first thing that made me think about where I sit and how quickly, and it shows you how that wasn't embedded or integrated in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Rasheem, you had other thoughts too?
Yeah, I mean, when Chris just mentioned the parent thing, like sometimes you can feel like you don't have no power when they get to be teenagers, but but you definitely have power, right? And the thing that it made me think of, with power, with parenting, with having certain types of in particular, a person might say, my daughter can go to the fridge and she could get any juice she wants, right? But I determine what goes into the fridge, right?
Mhm.
So I'm still determining, there's still an overlying realm of power being, even when she's exercising what appears to be her own agency. Her own agency is still under the umbrella of some predetermined, preset circumstances, right? Without necessarily hitting on a super defined or definition of power, there's like 4 things that I feel like that power has. And I feel like when these 4 things are present, if all of them, either one of them is an expression of power, but all 4 of them is like extremely powerful to me. And I'm able to recognize this. One is the ability to affect change is a space of power. Now, at that, it encompasses the ability to impact and change situations, actions, decisions, regardless of whether the change is perceived as negative or positive. It's still a form of power. I can enact change, right? And of course, the degree to which you can enact change is a measurement, I would say, of that particular type of power. Another one is the ability to define reality. To be able to say that something is or is not, or that it is fake news, or even the validation machines that we put ourselves through, that we put others through, that legitimize who we are, or further reaffirm the legitimacy of that particular thing. But I think having the ability to define what is real and what is not is an extremely powerful position. Also, and I think we're more familiar with this one, the ability to allocate resources, to say who gets what, when they get it, and how much they get, right, is definitely an example of power. And then 4th, which I don't think we contend with a lot, and this one is one of those more quote unquote scarier views of power, and that is the ability to defend against threats. I feel like is a strong position of power. And so sometimes, for example, I see the US communicating on a world stage about who gets to have nuclear weapons and who does not, right? Meanwhile, we're hoarding and we have all of these nuclear weapons. But to be able to have all 4 of those things, to define reality, impact change, defend yourself against threats, and allocate resources, are to me very strong prime examples of how power operates. And I'll stop there and hand it over to Chris for a bit. Chris, you want to chime in? Because I could go.
This is like, that's a lot.
Yeah, I'm trying to take that in for a second. I appreciate.
So some of the things that you said, Rasheem, oh my gosh, you have me thinking about also the characteristics of whiteness in society. So bear with me because this does relate. One characteristic of whiteness is the ability to define reality. And we see that even when we are thinking about how history is taught. And what history is taught as being real history, of the United States of America, right? And the different ways that history is taught, even in storytelling. Like for the past couple of years, I've been doing this study of like pre-1960s TV shows and the ways in which those shows teach a whiteness norm. So for instance, there was this show today where they were some of the white protagonists were very upset against a Native American who didn't understand that they were his friend. And just because he was on a reservation that he couldn't get off of without the army coming after him, and just because his village had been slaughtered, why does that mean that I, as the individual white person, can't be the friend? Why are you going to like drag policies into this whole thing? So again, the redefining of reality, even, you know, gaslighting about individual experiences, and that's the narrative that's on a TV show that everybody is uncritically drinking the Kool-Aid on, that ability to define reality. And also the ability to allocate resources is such a great example of the difference between institutional power and structural power, because institutions are now like backtracking on everything so-called DEI because they are afraid of losing federal resources.
Mm.
Because the federal government has said, if you do this DEI stuff, if you do a DEI, we're pulling all of your money. Johns Hopkins just had $800 million in funding revoked by the federal government. So
Yeah.
that ability to allocate resources to bend institutions to your will, right? That is one of the four things that you've defined as power. And we see
Yeah.
that happening. The thing about the ability to defend against threats, or even the ability to be a threat. Canada is the 51st state. We're going to take Greenland by any means necessary. I mean, we see these power displays on the national and international stage right now, right? And
Yeah.
we also have seen through US history the ability to affect change, which has absolutely nothing to do with positional power, but has to do with other forms of power that individuals like all of us can use. So I want to just throw out a couple of different types of power to see whether this resonates with people. And this gets to the first of the four, Rasheem, that you talked about, and that is the ability to affect change. So I've talked about legitimate or positional power, that power to defend, to issue threats, to give or withhold resources. But there's also information power. That power that comes from knowing what other people need, right, in order to make life better, to go about their functioning. And we can share, we can wield, we can hoard informational power. We do it in our families, we do it in our organizations, we do it all the time, but yet we don't call it that or even think about it as being a way in which we are holding and using power. We have expert power, you know, that's connected with our information power, but we know what we know, and our expertise is needed. The expertise of doctors, the expertise of plumbers, you know, the expertise of electricians. Society could not move without those essential functions. And because they are essential functions, that is a form of expert power. Institutions have reward power. Like, you can fire someone, you can give people raises, you can write people up, you can promote people or not, you can provide mentorship with people or not. And for everybody here who has been a supervisor, who has had the ability to impact change or affect change in the life of a colleague, or particularly someone who reports to you, you have wielded that power in some type of way, that coercive power. There is referent power, that power of who you know. Most people get jobs, not because they answered a want ad or went online, but because of who they know. And knowing someone brings you access to other people that can help you get to where you want to go. People have charismatic power. One of the best examples is Martin Luther King Jr., Fannie Lou Hamer, right? So many people with that charismatic power, which is essential when you don't necessarily have positional power, but it can rival positional power. There is moral power. And also, America goes to Martin Luther King, their version of him, what they want people to understand, not who he really was. They're not following that. But these are different types of power that individuals hold that really isn't discussed. And even individuals with these different types of power oftentimes don't feel that they have it, because we as a society are so stuck on the positional power that can issue threats, that can defend itself, that can allocate resources, that can define reality. What are your thoughts about those different types of power? And can you all think of other types of power that I've not mentioned?
I think when you mentioned institutional power, that definitely stood out for me in the ways that institutions are systems. And when you study systems theory, systems are built in a way that it is set up in a way that defends itself. And there are people who are within that institution or system that are benefiting from that. So they will reinforce that power. Another way I feel like that we don't talk about enough is the way that people have power by proxy. And that power is by proxy of that institution. So if my institutional power comes from the fact that people knows, let's say, for example, that I work at Johns Hopkins, I go and I say that everywhere, and that gives me access and opportunity into different spaces. That's power for proxy. There's ways in which and I didn't come up with this term that I'm about to use, that I feel like a lot of times Black people operate in spaces of sharecroppers, of white power. They don't necessarily have power within themselves, but they are sharecropping white power and operating in that space. That's what makes me think of when, as you talk about institutional power, and I'm going to tag Chris.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Wow. I also, so we haven't talked in terms of like I appreciated you walking through it, Adar, because I know that all of us can fit. I speak for myself that I see myself in each one of these. And then I even think about like the idea of just like the sheer financial power that of like, so the ability even to take a hit financially, but still be able to sustain yourself, right? And so I even think about, and I think about that and how that allows folks to operate, particularly when currently what it makes me think about like current unemployment, or it makes me think about COVID times. And I appreciate when you shared about how whiteness plays a role in this. And so particularly for white folks, even in my own neighborhood in this moment, that might be unemployed, but they have financial power where they're okay. There's power within your race and where you sit within like US society in this moment, where you're not living on the edge, where the next breath could take you off of it. And so I think like the sheer notion of like being able, like John Hopkins being able to financially take a hit, or a car industry being able to take a financial hit, and still there's a lot. So within that, there's still incredible financial power. And I just I just sit here and think about how positional power has when people just think of power as a positional power, that dehumanizes, and the dehumanization that goes into effect when, if that's all you think power is.
Mm.
So why do you think that so many people, especially people who are privileged by virtue of their membership in a historically advantaged societal group, right? Whether that is by race, whether that is by class, whether that is by gender identity, whether, I mean, regardless of what we're talking about, you know, ability, disability. Why do you think that people in historically privileged classes do not feel that they have power or run away from the power that they have? What is that about?
Mm.
I mean, I feel like it's a multitude of things. I think one of the things is that whatever the power that they are, like one of the things is the power that they are under, they recognize who is more powerful than them. People who are at a lower level on an org chart, or in terms of social stratification, are much more aware of the intricacies and interworkings of whoever is above them, because they have to know and learn that in order to operate and be. You need to know who has certain power over you and how that power operates, and how that power can mess up your well-being, your income, your livelihood. I think that's one way. I also feel like there's this stickiness with power, whether you say power in general or white power or black power. Associating something with power sometimes has this ugly connection or connotation with it. I think that that's also why we have a different relationship, for example, between the Black Power movement and Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is more like, please understand that I'm a human and I deserve to live and I matter. That's standing from a different position, as opposed to a person standing up with their fist proud saying Black Power, right? I think that it shows up in times where we see persons or people working to exercise their power, and seeing when people don't like folks exercising their power, how they respond. Like one of those four things that I meant is the right and the ability and the right to defend yourself against threats. Protests are largely a defense against threats, right? Other countries having weapons, it makes sense. Do you want to be able to defend yourself against threats? So when power starts to get built, you see this reaction to it, and it's a public display. And, you know, I'm going to go back to, racial power, or I'm going to go back to something racially, and look at and reflect on runaway slaves or people who would rise up against their masters. They would be made a public example of. Right. So there is a teaching that we do of, this is what will happen if you try to exercise your power or challenge this particular system. So I think those things are in play. I also think that there's visible power in terms of rules and policies and org charts, so we can know how the power structure works. But there's also invisible power, right? It's unwritten rules, it's social norms. There's hidden power that I feel like is a little bit more abstract and ambiguous. I also feel like we should be very much aware of soft power. Soft power shows up, I feel like, in things like diplomacy, cultural influences that you can have to sway people to do one thing or another. Propaganda is a form of soft power. So there's ways in which we don't see that. And then I think one of the powers, particularly if you're in a marginalized or historically oppressed group of people, is that there is power in collective. We have a collective power, and that is counter, I will say, to U.S. culture, in that U.S. culture teaches us rugged individualism, right? But when cultures get together, when groups get together and they activate and they exercise a collective power, I feel like that is the primary reason why folks like institutions like the FBI needed to take down Black Panther Party. They needed to take down Malcolm X. They needed to take out Fred Hampton, because their ability to get people to collectively move in a particular direction, right? I'm going to pause there because.
So let me, I mean, that you have said a word, right? And the whole thing of part of what you're bringing up too is the ways in which power is only seen to be non-threatening when it acts within the socially acceptable structures. When it acts outside of those structures, then power and realization of power becomes a threat. And that is when it has to be taken down. I love that you brought up the fact about soft power, because again, getting back to these TV shows, our media, all of our media consumption are examples of soft power.
Yeah.
Because we just accept things as they are fed to us, like the whole conversation about DEI. So many people don't even know what that is, but they just accepted a definition or a characterization of what it is from the soft power of media that they consume. And we don't explore, investigate, we don't critique, so we just consume. We're a consumerist society, and one thing that we consume is the propaganda of the way in which soft power puts out that propaganda. Ebony, you said something about power. You had a comment. Can you expand on that, please?
Yeah, I have found that when I'm dealing particularly with folks who seem to have a lot of power, especially in an organization, and are white, there is this powerlessness that comes just from the idea that they don't have complete power over everything. So that is something that I've noticed time and time again. It's like they do have quite a bit of power to make a lot of changes and impacts on people's lives, but because they don't have the total control over everything, there's kind of this almost learned helplessness. And then even sometimes it goes into the space of like things that they do have control to change, they kind of default to, I don't know if I can like do that, but it's like definitely within their wheelhouse of the power that they do hold. But yeah, so I don't know. That's just something that I've noticed. Like without complete control, then it doesn't count at all.
Yeah.
Oh.
Go ahead, Rasheem.
Well, Ebony, one of the things that what you're saying speaks to me is the acknowledgement of their actual power. And what it is they don't want to compromise their position and existing power to fight for whatever this other thing is. That to me speaks to a clear awareness. I have this and I like this, and this is a privilege, and this is access, and this is opportunity. And if I do that, this is going to mess up this over here. That's what that says to me.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely.
And
I agree.
Susan, did you have your hand up, or is it Mark with his hand up? You're muted.
Historically, power has always meant, you're number two, define reality. That's one part. It would seem nowadays with social media, people have the power to define, just consider the term fake news. If I say it enough and it's retweeted enough, 2 and 2 no longer equals 4. And to me, that is so frightening. There was a conservative senator back in the 1970s in New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was, I think, the first to say, everyone's entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts.
Mark, you are winning my heart when you pull in some history. That is all I need to be happy. Yes, thank you so much.
I feel like that's also, sorry, I got so much.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. No, please.
Mark, I feel like that's also a great example of soft power redefining reality, right? You have propaganda, you have marketing, you have a person who's constantly saying, whether they're saying there's no pandemic, you don't have to wear a mask, blah, 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 whatever the thing is that they're saying, that's soft power. And then now it's a whole different reality. This is fake and this is real. Okay.
Listen, when someone is able to say, as happened in at least 2 instances, this person is not Jewish, this person is now Palestinian because I say so, or when someone is able to say, you know what, this candidate, I didn't even know she was Black. I thought she was Indian until she turned Black. And then you have media reporting those things as if it is not the crazy racist rantings of somebody, but as if that those are true statements to be given the real estate of media time. That is a use of power, not only by the person saying that, but also by one of the tools, media, that continue to propagandize false statements and use false statements like that. Andy, you were saying that white people want to escape the implications of using the power privilege gives them. Say more.
Yeah, I think that there is a practice, particularly of white anti-racist folks on the left, to decry the power of whiteness, and then to try to sort of escape the implications of having that power without actually giving up the power. And so then you end up in a space where white people who have the power to influence change and have a sense of justice are afraid to use that power because they think the power is a whiteness practice. And it may very well be, but without transferring that power or pushing that power out to somebody else, there's sort of, I think, this hoarding of power that occurs and then a fear to use it. And I think that that is a thing that we need to confront. I think it is certainly a whiteness practice to hoard power, but I also think it is a whiteness practice to not use it when you have it. And I think those two things sort of combine to create this escapism that oftentimes leads white folks on the left interested in justice to try to pretend that the world doesn't work on power. And I think that we need to call that out and confront it. And when we are in positions, even if we're working to push the power out and to change the power structure, we have to use it because other white folks are going to be using it for injustice, is sort of how I feel about that. So I think that's.
Yeah, thank you. And Andy, what do you, because just to add to what you're sharing, another thing that I see is that they also decrying it, but refusing to use the power that they hold is also their running away from their having that power and using it as other white people, but not me. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, we're running away from it, running away from using it, but not running away from having it.
Right, yeah.
And I think that that is a really dangerous escapist practice that allows, that does not recognize that if there are white folks in positions to exert influence and change, but they're not doing it because they're afraid that that's a whiteness practice, that they are surrendering that power that they have to either a vacuum or to white folks who will use it for injustice. And so it's like, I get the tendency to say, oh, well, the power that is vested in me is illegitimate and it comes from centuries of white supremacy and things like that. And it's like, it's true, it does. And we should be doing everything we can to push that power away and to divest ourselves from that power. And when we have it, we can't be afraid to use it, and we can't be afraid of the concept of power. Otherwise, we're squandering it. We're squandering the ability we have to, define reality, to change outcomes, to defend from threats, and to allocate resources. And so I think that there is, and to me, it's one of the worst aspects of white privilege discussions is that it causes escapism in a sense to try to get away from a reality without actually taking the material steps to get away from that reality.
Thank you. Another thing I noticed about that, and I wonder where you all would see this fitting within this power conversation, the assumption that that Black and non-Black movements of color need to move to white movements, that they need to come and join those movements, participate in those movements, when there are many Black and non-Black people of color that have been doing movement work, and those movements, those organizations have been grounded in the work for years, for decades. And yet some kind of upstart white-led movement who's new to the game is all of a sudden saying to those people who've been in it to win it since the beginning, no, y'all need to come over here to what we're doing. Where do you see power operating in even that assumption and expectation?
Chris, you want to tackle it?
Well, I think we've seen this, and I think that I'm just sitting here thinking about like the good white person, and like I want to do this, and then, but I feel like it's not operating from an anti-racist lens. So I think the idea that I struggle with is even saying that you are anti, like even claiming that that person is anti-racist. So that might be extreme, but for me, I think like I would push it there because that's not understanding the system we're in. That's not understanding the power structure that was built off of the Constitution. That was, and so I think this idea of and this too often happens. It happens in movements. It also happens when institutions go into communities and think like, oh, you want this? Well, we push our, we don't even power share because we already have in mind what there's already in mind what it is we want. I think to your example, Rasheem, about a parent saying you can, you know, your child can go in the refrigerator, but I've decided what's in the refrigerator already, right? And I had the financial power for that to happen. I had the resources for that to happen, right? And I get to make the decision whether you come with me or not to the store. And so I still have this over domain of power. And I think to your point, Adar, when talking about white folks trying to join a movement that has already happened, when that takes over, like that power play of whiteness just supersedes. If you don't have the right analysis, you still run the risk of that, whether it's intentional or unintentional.
Thank you. So what I really adore about this conversation thus far is that we are talking about like the real deal on the ground ways, the everyday ways in which power operates, right? Not the theoretical, not the national, although we've discussed some of that too, but really rooting this discussion in our choices on the day-to-day from our positions of influence. And Chris, I want to turn to you because of the work that you and Stacy are doing with Sharp and using your positional power to work to change an industry which often has operated out of this whiteness centered noblesse oblige. We're helping the poor marginalized people practices, and I am talking human services. So want you to talk about that because of the work that you all are doing inside of that system to create change. Can you share a little bit about that, please?
Sure. So some of the work we're doing in the human services system is really part of what Sharp is asking us to do, is to take a step back and understand history with an anti-racist, anti-oppressive lens, like understanding the history of how we even got here, and understanding the whole historical context of the profession and even of social work, right? And we can't do anything until we actually understand the fullness of that, and understanding the values and beliefs and the narratives at the start of that conversation of and how that is racialized specifically here in the United States. And so Sharp is a framework with 5 components to it. So the first part I was just talking about is the structuralized trauma, right? Which we know from history must include in the conversation racism and oppression. and then taking a look at the H, which is the historical context of how structural racism and oppression gets passed on from generation to generation to generation. And so then we often wonder why there's a difference in terms of the way a white person or white family interacts with the system versus a Black person, Black family interacting with the system and their responses to the system, right? Based on their historical context of how the mistreatment, the dehumanization has occurred from generation to generation. And then if we know this, so if we know structural racism exists, I was just sharing this with folks the other day. I was saying, like, the first thing is you have to be aware of it. And then if you can, then what shapes what your role is, right? So A is your analysis of role. And so this idea that I often think about, particularly as a white person and in human services, is too often we think of ourselves as the savior. I heard someone today talk about superheroes. Human service professionals are superheroes. And we have our superhero cape on. But if that's your analysis of what this is, then you're still going in with this expertise and you're wielding all the power. I am here to save you. That gives you the ultimate power, right? And our idea in this conversation is to say, no, every human being has power. We need to go through, just as Adar has and Rasheem, about like the different characteristics and the different types of power, so folks can see this and then have opportunities to use their power. So my role has now shifted where I'm no longer just always standing in front of someone. Now sometimes I have to do that, right? With my privilege, with my race, including my gender, that I have to stand in front of someone. But there's sometimes, more often than not, that I should stand beside someone. And a lot of times get out of the way and stand behind someone so that they can use their power, right? So I use the thing about Adar, you were talking about like the movements and white folks creating their own thing and then wanting to take over a movement. Well, my idea would be for white folks to stand behind, use the power that we have, the resources and everything, and offer that up. But we don't need to be sometimes in depending on the space we're in, we might need to stand in front of folks. But that doesn't necessarily mean we change the vision or the values or whatever the ask was, right? And so I often think about myself, how do I position myself? I position myself in front of folks, beside folks, behind folks. And what has been the conversation, the collaboration that allows me to do so? And then also thinking about the R real quick is reciprocity and mutuality. And then P does get to the power piece. And so that's the sharp framework in a real small time frame. But that's what we're talking about. We're talking about making sure, acknowledging that every person has power. And it's our job to support them in using their power. That's our job, is to support them in using their power. If we have the resources, offer those resources up. But so we have to do that in direct services, but then we have to push the system as a whole in understanding how to rethink and reimagine itself.
No, thank you, Chris. We know that when individuals or movements want to challenge establishment power, that there are risks there. And are there risks that those of you who are involved in SHARP are taking as you challenge that establishment power and in the industry?
Yes, I think there is huge risk in all of this because the industry has been set up to sustain itself. And when you start, there is risk at every level. So when folks say, oh, it's too risky in my position, one, it's been a hell of a risk for the folks you provide services to. And it's risky from top down, left, right. The whole thing is risky because the system wants to keep sustaining itself. It gets more money the more folks that are in it, in human services. And so there is a certain amount of risk, but the risk looks different based on the identities you hold. And I guess that's something that I've been really struggling with, particularly for white folks in my personal life and in my community, that the risk in all of this looks different. So let's not compare it. You know, so our safety nets are different. The system's designed so white folks have the safety net. The generational impact has created such an incredible safety net, particularly for white folks.
Thank you. And I see that Leah is saying, I love your comment, Chris, about it's risky for the families we're providing services to, because that is very easy to forget. So I want to turn the conversation from you two to everybody who is here. And I want to ask you all to think about the type of power that you hold, because none of us are powerless. We just don't think about the type of power that we hold, and we don't think about the level of risk that we are willing to assume. And so we're asking you to think about that now. And we're just going to give you a couple minutes. Now, this is a time where you can go off camera and not be put in a waiting room. We are going to give you about 30 seconds to a minute just to write down how you hold power. What type of power do you hold? Do you hold a power based on your position? Do you hold power based on your expertise knowledge, based on your referent knowledge, who you know, based on whether you can give out, you have reward power? What type of power do you have, and at what table do you have it? Within your institution, within your place of worship, within your an affinity group that you belong to, an association that you belong to? Where do you have it? Let's turn off our cameras for about 30 seconds. I'll call us back then. All right, if we can slowly pull ourselves away and come back on camera. So, thoughts. Who wants to start? Leah, since you made the last comment, I'm going to call on you.
Alrighty, thank you.
So I'm currently a foster care worker with social services. So I think a lot about the power of my attention and intention with what I spend my time with, since I have so many things I'm required to do, but that still leaves room for what I'm spending my time working towards with a family, whether that be with the bio family or with the resource parents, or if I'm defending what I'm investing my time in, I think is very powerful. I also think about my power in my notes and my documentation when I'm writing court reports and what I'm sharing with like literally on record with the government, but also just what I'm advocating for in those court reports. So there's a lot of discretion, and that's not even scratching the surface, but that's what comes to mind.
Thank you. And again, what I want everybody to think of for themselves, you don't have to share this out loud, but what level of risk are you willing to take as you go about your day-to-day functions? Stacy, what about you?
Well, I mean, thinking about the types of power, I think I definitely have all of them in various spaces and time, or I've had them at different points in my life. I think, definitely right now, I think I do have some positional power. I think a power that I have and I use, but I'm reflecting that I could use more is like charisma power. Like I do think I have an ability to develop relationships, utilize relationships. And I'm just thinking, I do that in my work professionally, but I think there's another step for me personally and in my community because I am in a early stage of motherhood. I think I have stepped back a lot. And I think this is a time to step forward to say, okay, how can I utilize the relationships, the resources, the access that I have to do more? And so that's just something I'm walking away with and thinking more deeply about.
Thank you. And I would also ask you about just to contemplate the level of risk you are willing to assume, because you talk about being in the early stages of parenthood, and that brings up this like really critical point that we are willing to assume different levels of risk at different points in our lives. And that we have to factor that in, acknowledge that, and be okay with that without beating ourselves up about it, right? With risk, it is not static. Risk is a fluid thing, and our willingness to be, our ability to assume different levels of risk is a fluid thing. Andy, what about you?
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting question. At work, I have relatively limited formal power, but I have a lot of ability to influence outcomes for folks. I am consulted on conversations that ultimately make decisions about what work we do, who gets to do what roles, and who gets to keep their job. And I don't get to make those decisions, but it would be crazy to think that I don't have plenty of power to get consulted on it and shape those decisions. I'm in the Green Party, and on the national level, I chair two committees that allocate resources. They give money to people, they give resources to people, and so that's real and formal power. Broadly, and I'm a candidate that's running as a Green candidate, and so I have the power to use each of those forms of power within the party because I'm a party leader. But that choice of party mitigates the power I have at a broader level, and I would say significantly increases the risk to my job and to my community power. And so while my job right now is fine with me running as a Green Party candidate, I'm not sure that they would be fine with me challenging Trump's policies on DEI, challenging Musk's investments in capital and things like that. So there's a tension for me between how I choose to exercise my political power and the kind of power that I have at work. And they've said I'm fine, but we've gone through 3 or 4 rounds of layoffs that have laid off 25% of the staff in the last 2 years. And I would not be surprised if at some point I run afoul of them because they see something that I've said publicly that does not at all agree with the corporation, or that somebody else raises to them because I have pissed them off, and the corporation feels like it is worthwhile to cut me loose. So, you know, I think that it is like I have formal power as a result of being in a leadership position in a political organization, and that formal power has real risks for me, you know. And if I get on Jane Miller's show and talk about how individuals and corporations need to pay reparations, and somebody forwards that to my bosses, I have no power within the corporation to stop them from doing whatever they want about.
Thank you. You brought up another form of power, Andy, that has not been mentioned yet, and that is influencer power. And just about all of us have influencer power, whether we know it or not. And so the question is how we use it and for what purpose. Ebony, what form of power or forms of power?
Yeah, I find myself in a really interesting space right now where I'm unattached to any institution. And so I feel I didn't expect to feel so empowered by that, like the freedom to say whatever I want to say in spaces without the fear. I think like facing the fear of not having like formal employment, it's like very liberating. So it's like I feel that I can go into spaces and honestly give my perspective on strategies. Like earlier today I was talking with a group of social workers, and I felt much less restriction in ways that I could address like the powers that we hold as social workers. And then they're just like using conversation as space for strategy and like unearthing the stuff that goes unsaid so often. So in this particular moment, I have power of freedom and power of time, so I can like show up in more spaces, and I can share my perspectives, and then also like help other people come to understand where their roles and their power is. So yeah, that's where I'm at like today.
Today. Thank you. Susan.
I was going to start by saying that I'm recently retired, and that is, you know, a big adjustment. So I'm kind of, as I listen to this conversation, thinking what I used to be, who I was, what power influences there were. And Ebony, thank you for your comment about it being a place of greater freedom, because sometimes I feel that's not the case for me. And yet I can see where it can be too. But anyway, I'm just feeling my way with that. But when I was working, I think one of the powers, and I think this touches on what you had to say just a minute ago, that I worked for a very long time in the same department, over 20 years, and I had a certain historical knowledge of things we'd been through, things that worked well, things that didn't work well, and could contribute that at times, being the oldest member of that department. And I think that there was, I mean, it wasn't like I was dictating anything to anyone, but I would offer information from a historical standpoint that I think influenced where we went and how we handled different situations. So I never thought of that as being particularly powerful, but it does have an influencing effect, that's for sure.
It sure does. And Mark, now that we're here,
Uh,
your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I retired in 2019, right before COVID. I spent my career really as a sales and sales management consultant and trainer. But I've had some clients that asked me to unretire for various reasons. But I've been in a position, as anyone who does consulting of any kind, you start out from a position of power. You have all the answers, or many of them, supposedly. That's why people hire you and continue to work with you, and hopefully with better outcomes. And it over time, it became less risky for me because maybe I was more confident what I was doing. I developed more expertise. But now that I'm mostly retired, I find myself very much unencumbered and actually willing to take more risks, to say things that might have pissed some people off in the past, but they can't fire me.
Mhm, mhm.
And
That's the beauty of it.
yeah, I enjoy that feeling.
And thank you for bringing up again the expertise power, because when you're talking about the power that consultants have, we definitely have the expertise power, which gives us the ability to maybe say things that people inside of a client organization that they can't say because the risk is too great for them. So that our saying it, that's a way in which we can exercise our power and lessen the risk for other people. Susan?
I just want to throw this idea in. I don't think we have time to address it particularly tonight, but one of the things that's coming up for me a lot is where we stand spiritually and what power we have because of that. Either that it gives us a sense of identity, maybe a group kind of association, and maybe just a sense of strength, inner strength to do what we feel compelled to do. But I think that's another kind of power that I've been thinking about more these days, particularly since retirement and all.
Thank you. And yes, that can be a 13th of the month event. As we think about the ways in which our beliefs and our spirit life can inform what we do and why we take risk. And also as we think about the ways in which those very same things have been used to uphold white supremacist, very cruel power structure. In talking about a white evangelical movement that is undergirding so much of what we're seeing. Thank you. We'll consider those things for a 13th of the month. Dottie.
I've been thinking about that very question a lot lately because I'm at a completely different place in my life as an older person in good health and with no responsibilities to be the caregiver, which is the first time being in that space, for most of my life. And that there is a freedom in that has really connected with what I do in the world right now, in the country we're in. And I feel like I'm the prime candidate for being pushed in the front of the group when the guns come out. I said this at a group meeting recently, and people were like, "What?" No, it's real. I've had a wonderful life, and I'm in this place where if it should end or my health should be affected, right now, my risk is so minimal compared with so many people who have children to take care of, parents to take care of, a job to make a living and continue being able to just survive and have a place to live and food to eat. So all of those things have really made me realize just what a privileged position I'm in, being a white person with all the other things I've already mentioned. So that's been a real kind of, this is a factor, that I can place within whatever decisions I'm making.
Thank you, Dottie. It just brings up once again that when we are really clear about the level of risk we are willing to assume, then all of our other decisions become a little bit easier. Devel.
Thank you for actually calling on me because I'm just about to jump into another meeting that I have scheduled. But for me, it would be easy to, talk about the power and influence in regards to the role that I play with meeting with clients and being an advocate for clients and utilizing, skills that specialize. But I think right now, as I was listening into myself, listening and thinking to myself, but I more so wanted to reflect and share on the position of power that came from me being a caretaker for my father once my mother passed away. My mother passed away in 2019. I was a newlywed. My wife and I had a conversation, and we decided, you know what, we're gonna bring the old man into our home, and we're gonna, take care of him and try to provide the quality of care, and not really understanding the power in that position that you volunteer on. And now that he's passed away, maybe 2 months ago, 3 months ago, and missing him and thinking about him, just the referent power in that position, and being able to make those decisions, and being the youngest in my family, the only sibling that's still here in the state, and just taking that on and having individuals just allow me the trust in me to do that. It's really humbling, and I just have no regrets. But again, I never really thought of the power that that experience, would have until I was thrusted in it, and, kind of baptized with fire, not knowing what to do and learning as I go and experiencing, all of the emotions that come along with that, but realizing, what about those that don't have a voice that's in that position? you know, and the power that's being utilized in those or manipulated in those situations out in the community. And I'm just grateful and humbled, and that was just on me as we were just discussing, the power and that we have and the risk, and just tying it in there. I just selfishly made it personal to my more recent experience. But I thank you for calling on me, because I was just typing in the chat that I was going to have to jump off, but all things happen for a reason.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, Devel, thank you for sharing that experience, right? Because Rasheem, when you were here last time, one thing that you said is that we focus on the national, but everything is local. And in that everything is local, everything just starts in our homes. And if we're not organizing within our families and treating them in the way that we want the world to be, then what are we doing with anything else that is external? So your sharing of this is just such a beautiful reminder of that to us all. Thank you so much. I'm glad that you didn't have to dip before you gifted us with that story. And we hope to see you again in other forums. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Take care.
You too. So we have Mohammad and Arthur before we end. Mohammad, where are you with all of this?
Well, I'm a psychotherapist, a social worker, and I sit with folks, and one power I have, that's the position it gives me, that license that state of Maryland has given me as a social worker, and the trust that people instill in me. They see in me. They come to me. I have the power of my words, and I have the power of my voice in the way of being able to speak softly to someone who's been so injured badly. But most importantly, I think the power to choose radical social, and externalized pathology. That is, when people come and they believe that the depression exists within them and they have created it, and the pathology, they are the creator of the pathology. And for me to say, but society has a role in constructing that, in externalizing that. That's the power that I have, and at the same time, it's the risk I take. Because it's within the system, it's much easier to regurgitate all the symptoms of bipolar disorder and this and that, and call people even bipolar, as if they are synonymous with pathology. They are creative of it. I take a big risk. I operate on the margins, but that also is my power. I choose to see people in one-on-one mostly, and influence them towards healing their own torn hearts, if I may say, and the injuries to their psyche and to their bodies. So at the same time, I'm an immigrant and
And that's it. Thank you. And again, it reminds me that our use of power go hand in hand with our risk. And the more power we have, we can assume more risk, or we can hold on to power or hoard that power and not assume risk at all. Thank you, Mohammad. And Arthur, bring this home. Where were you in terms of your power?
I think, in some ways I kind of tick all the boxes, right? I mean, I've got educational power, color, experience, gender, like all that stuff. Parent, I'm an oldest child. So even in that family system, right, I carry a different weight, I guess, a different power than my siblings. But I was thinking too, organizationally, that's kind of where I'm doing more of my thinking. I've got kind of relational, positional, in my case, spiritual, because that's the dynamic of that organization. And so all of those give me that capacity to be part of affecting change, defining reality, allocating resources, like all of those are very real. And so I guess what I'm wrestling with or thinking about or taking away is when and how to be cautious, when to exercise those, what is a good exercise of those. I think in my case, it's often making sure that those are collaborative, making sure that they're not, how do I not think of power as something of mine to give to other people, but to be part of sharing with other people. I'm not sure if that's the right way to describe it, but so I think that's kind of just some of the power dynamics I'm thinking of as far as me. I think that the last thing I'll just say is being kind of newer to Baltimore, like I don't find that I have much here because I don't have relation position, like all those kinds of things that I would have within my organization or in others' context. So in a way, I kind of appreciate that. This kind of like in the broader city, I'm new and I have no experience and bring very little, but maybe I don't. Maybe I carry some of those across with me. I'm not sure. So something to think about maybe.
Thank you. And Chris and Rasheem, as we begin to close out, what are your thoughts? And Rasheem, I see that you put something in chat. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, just to highlight a few things, just to highlight the significance of understanding and actually examining and studying power, understanding its antecedents, its origin, what is the design, what is that also involves an understanding of the historical context, the social context, identifying key actors and their motivation, and recognizing the systems and structures that perpetuate a particular power dynamic. So that's one part. And so those questions are, what power do you have? How did you come to have that power? What is the source? What do you use your power in the service of for real? What is your theory of change about how you use your power? If I use power like this, then what? What is your theory about how you can bring about change? And then I would say consider, these are just beginning steps to consider studying power. Consider a person that you greatly respect who brought about great change. And you could consider several people. It's probably most helpful if the person is proximate to whatever you do professionally. And that is, what power did they have? How did they come to have that power? What are the antecedents of that power? What is the origin of that power? What is the source of that power? What did they use their power in the service of? And what was their theory of change about how they brought about power? And I highlight those questions as a beginner to start to study and understand power and how you can leverage power to bring about change. But also to highlight the ways in which, and I've definitely done quite a bit of this, is I've done a lot to study power in the US, white structures of power and that sort of thing. But what I was missing was a study of Black people's power and how they've operated in it to be able to use as a source. And once I started to do that, I become better informed. There are certain books, Blueprint for Black Power by Amos Wilson. There's a chapter in Frantz Fanon's book called Pitfalls of National Consciousness. And it just talks about, well, I mean, you could read the book, but what I want to say is understanding how external body uses power and how that power is forced upon you is good to understand and know, right? What is even better to know is how have people who have navigated spaces that you are currently in that have been in worse situations than you are, because right now we're in a state where there is a lot of woe is me, and I understand it to a degree, but I know that I have ancestors that had so much more to overcome, and they left blueprints and they left books and they left instructions. So if I go to those and I study their power and how they used it, then I can use that to inform how I move and better understand the design of that power to get access to understanding how do I redefine reality? How do I help to allocate resources? How do I bring about change? And how do I protect myself and those that I care about against threats? Because if you are not doing those four, in my personal humble opinion, you are practicing power with a lowercase p. And I want to practice power with a capital P, not just for myself and my small sphere, but I want it to reverberate and go out from me. And I'm going to say this one last thing and I'll be quiet. And I think an example of folks who have a particular type of power that have not studied a lot of Black power. We are in super Black Baltimore. This city is over 60% Black. We have the country's only Black governor, right? And we live in a state that is purple and progressive, and we still send more Black boys to adult prison than any other state when there's so many Black people here, and the governor is a Black man, and the mayor is a Black man. So what is operating there? What that tells me is they are operating from a different playbook of power and cozy up and getting themselves proximate to a power that they feel like is more dominant and distancing themselves from a more collective power that could bring about positive change. They're making big change and they're making change in their own personal life, and their status is continuing, and they're going to get promoted, and they're going to get on and continue to get higher and higher titles. But what does that mean for the collective? And I'm off my soapbox now.
And I think that is one of the reasons, Rasheem, why we all wanted this discussion about power, right? Because if we only stick with the false narrative that positional power is power, if we never discuss the different types of power, we cannot understand how groups who are historically marginalized have been able to wrestle power outside of an establishment power structure and use that power to upend that establishment power on its head. I completely agree about the blueprints of power. And that's why, you know, there's some groups that whose experiences in this country have equipped them for this moment, and other groups who are ill-equipped for this moment because they've not had to do anything about power outside of an establishment power structure, which has benefited them. Chris, bring us home. What are your thoughts?
So I would like us all just to think about the times where we have said something similar to "it's out of my hands. I don't have the power." I mean, I think we first have to be aware and interrogate ourselves, right? And so I would just ask that we continue to do that and say things like, "That's just what happened. That's just what happens here." Or "Nothing I can do. It is what it is," right? There's moments where we do that. And again, I think that think about the person receiving that, the family receiving that, a community receiving that, and how dehumanizing that is. And so I think we first have to be aware of where this is showing up every single day for us. So that would just be my first thought in this. And then I also want to say, like, I love the question, Adar. What level risk are you willing to assume? Right? And I will just be real clear on this, because I will also offer this. What do you want your legacy to be? And I think that's something really, really important. So for me, I think it's personal. I have 3 young, beautiful, rambunctious children, and I think about this every single day. I think about it every single day. And I think, like, what do I live in a community, I have neighbors, I have families. What do I want my legacy to be? What am I protecting? And so I think that's something really, really important that we talk about as we navigate this idea of power, as we navigate this idea of discretion within power. And so that's just what I would leave us with, because this is what I've been toggling with. Because I've been when Adar asked this question probably 2+ years ago to me about level of risk, I don't know. I don't know. And so and Dottie, I appreciated the clarity you offered about the level of risk. And I think that's a model of, like, even for me and a younger generation. I know that we were talking about the generation differences, but honestly, to think, what do I want my legacy to be? And I think we have to start asking folks in positional power about that as well. You know, do you want to protect the building, or do you want to protect the people that need to use the building? And so thinking about it in that light, and I'll just leave it there.
You know, thank you. And also just the reminder for Dottie and Chris that this is an intergenerational work. Right. And so the blueprints that you all offered, and thank you all for the links to different books, Ebony, Andy, Rasheem, the link to the documentary Baltimore Still Rising. I encourage everybody to write down those book titles, to click on that link to this documentary about Baltimore. And that documentary explores the different forms of power and how people in this Black under-resourced communities have found and used their power. There is something that each of us can do. Chris, what you were bringing up about what do we want our legacy to be? This writer, Jonathan Swift, says power is no blessing in itself, except when it is used to protect the innocent. And so this question about our legacy, to whom are we in service with our use of power and with the risk we are willing to take? The answer to that question, as well as the answer to the questions that Rasheem posed, are questions that if there's nothing else that any of us take from our time together, we need to take these questions so that we can do the work of pondering these answers. As we close out, I just want to thank Rasheem and thank Chris for your wisdom, for your insights, for everyone who has participated. Thank you for your sharing and your honest reflection. And we will